Around the summer of 2012 or 2013, when I was about 13, I spent the summer in South Dakota with my uncle from the middle of June to the middle of August. During my time, him and I had quite a few interesting adventures, accidentally macing ourselves, being charged by a grizzly bear, driving home through a tornado. But this is the one that I can't stop thinking about. Toward the end of my stay, we decided that we would go on one last hike. We had been hiking a few times beforehand, Yellowstone and Bear Butte, and figured we could squeeze in one more. He suggested going for a roughly 5 or 6 mile overnight camp and hike in Cloud Peak Wilderness, Wyoming. When we got there, we hiked for about 3 miles on trail before he suggested going off trail for a little bit. At some point, we came across an opening that had a medium-sized lake, a waterfall, and flat rock surfaces mixed with the surrounding woods. We decided to set up camp for the night near the rock surfaces, but still on the soft forest ground. We set up the tent, a small contained fire, and hung up our food supplies to avoid any nosy critters. During the night, we heard a variety of noises, from twigs snapping, owls hooting, and one of the scarier ones, wolves howling in the distance. My uncle brought his 5th generation iPod, the first ones that were able to play videos and movies. He put on Star Wars: A New Hope. We're both people who can't sleep without background noise, and frankly, the background noises of the forest at night were starting to make me feel slightly unsettled. I fell asleep within about 20 or 30 minutes of the movie starting. When I woke up, the movie was over and the screen was black, but it was still very dark out, so I don't know what time it was. Within 2 minutes of waking up, I hear this loud clicking sound. It was fast and rhythmic, but not repetitive. Each set never sounded the same as the last one. My brain jumped to woodpecker immediately, but then I remembered that they don't peck at night. It seemed to be getting louder. My heart was beginning to race, and I was starting to freeze up. To my horror, the clicking sound started multiplying, now coming from several directions. Some were close, some sounded like they could have been miles away. From what it sounded like, there was possibly 7 or 8 distinct areas where the sound was coming from. My uncle awoke in the uproar of the sounds. He froze as soon as he sat up. His breathing became heavy and he was noticeably terrified. He's a big dude, and I've never seen him like this, so when he reacts that way, I definitely know my fear is valid. We both looked at each other in absolute horror and confusion. The clicking sounds were nearly hurting our ears at this point. All of a sudden, through the sound, there was a gunshot in the distance, followed by a loud screech. The only way I can describe it was like a lion's roar mixed with a woman's blood-curdling scream. The air became still. Everything became instantly silent. The only sound remaining being my breath and the breeze. My uncle and I just sat there, shocked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. After we were able to gain some self-control, we decided the only thing we could do was go back to sleep. Obviously, that wasn't happening, so I lay there for maybe 3 hours, just listening to the still silent atmosphere. Once morning broke, we packed up as fast as we could, not speaking a single word, and started hiking back. We tried to remember the way in which we had gotten there, but for some reason, nothing looked familiar. We berated each other with questions, trying to maybe spark a memory. Nothing worked, and we couldn't recall a single detail of our hike beyond the point of being on the trail. We hiked for 6 hours, hoping that the direction we were heading in was right. Eventually, we found some relief when we noticed the trail. We saw a trail sign and looked at it to try to figure out where we were. We were confused when we noticed we were still 2 miles from where we parked. How? How did we hike for so long and still be 2 miles out when we only planned for a 5 or 6 mile hike? We got back to the car and drove home. Once home, we searched for the area where we camped and were actually able to find it. What I didn't understand was that it was 22 miles from where we parked, and yet somehow we don't remember anything about the hike. To this day, we don't really talk about it that much. We have some sort of unspoken agreement to acknowledge that what happened wasn't normal, and I think we're still to this day trying to process it. This was, and still is, one of the most terrifying and strange experiences of my life. So, what the hell happened that day and night? If anyone has any theories or similar experiences, please share them. Thanks for listening. So, over the course of my life, I've had several paranormal experiences, most of them fairly minor. A few stick out to me though. I think about this one in particular a lot, because I've never heard of anything similar to it. I've always been a night owl, and I've always had trouble sleeping normally, or staying asleep at night. This is only relevant because the times I've seen this entity for certain were very late at night or early in the morning. The first and clearest time I saw it was when I was an adolescent. I'm really bad with dates and times, so I don't remember what age specifically, but probably when I was about 13 or so. I'm 21 now, so it wasn't recent. It was around 2 or 3 a.m., and I randomly woke up. This is normal for me. I decided to get up and get a glass of water. The door to my room is at the end of a horizontal hallway that has a bedroom on each end, a door to the bathroom door in the middle, and an archway right next to my bedroom door that leads into the living room. I go to the kitchen, do my thing, and then I go back. As I opened the door and entered my room, I kinda turned back as I was closing it, and at the other end of the hallway, right in front of the closed door to the other bedroom, I saw something. It was standing in front of the closed door at the other end of the hallway. It had a completely blank, pure white head that really stood out in the dark. No face or ears. Its neck and body were black, and for lack of a better term, uniform and shapeless. It almost looked like he was wearing a long poncho or cloak or something. It was average height, maybe a little on the tall side, but not inhumanly so. Its neck was black too, so the only non-black part of it was the head. It also looked solid, and not ethereal in any way. I looked directly at its face for maybe 5 seconds, and then I closed the door on it. I freaked out about it in the morning, but at that moment, I felt calm, but definitely weirded out. I fell asleep an hour or so later without any further incident. The next morning, the first thing I did was check out of the hallway to make sure there wasn't something in front of the door or hanging on it that I could have mistaken for something unnatural. And there wasn't. I didn't get any particular feelings from it, one way or another. It didn't feel like it was a threat to me, but it didn't feel benevolent either. But I did feel like it was looking at me when I was looking at it. I've had many other strange things happen to me in this house after that, and my mother and father have also experienced many, again mostly minor, paranormal things that align with my own experiences. Enough that my mom has gone from someone who didn't really believe in the paranormal to such a staunch believer. But I never saw anything that I was certain was this specific entity again, until about a month ago. I know the exact date and time this one happened because I actually made a note in my phone about it right after it happened. It was on May 19th at 5:43 a.m. So, I get up to get a snack after an accidental all-nighter. As I was looking in the pantry, I saw something weird out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, and peeking around the corner of the kitchen entryway wall at me was that same blank white head. Right after I looked at it directly, it moved back behind the wall and disappeared. This time, it startled the hell out of me. Enough so that I actually waited in the kitchen a few minutes, since I had to walk past where it was to get back to my room. It still didn't give me any bad vibes though, it just made me jump. This time, I could tell for sure that it was solid, because the light from the window reflected off of it. What I really want to know is this. Has anyone ever heard or encountered something similar? I've never seen anything about a non-fictional entity with a blank white face, and my half-assed Google search about it didn't turn up anything. If anyone has any ideas about what this might be, I would love to hear them. My entire life, I've had strange experiences with the paranormal and supernatural, premonitions, and dreams. I dream a lot, nearly every night, with clear and vivid dreams. Oftentimes, multiples that I can alter and control at will. But sometimes they'll be different. Not in a way that I can easily describe, but the feeling is unmistakable. Instead of my mind being the driving force in this experience, it feels more like I'm being shown something that can't be manipulated. When these happen, they're the only thing I can dream about all night, or at least the only thing I can remember, and I never forget them. They stay with me like an actual physical experience. This was one of those dreams. I could see myself through the eyes of something else, or at least the energy that made up my being. It looked like a bright yellow ball of light, hurtling through an empty black nothingness, but I had a very strong feeling that this was me. I could feel the absence of warmth through whatever was observing me as it followed me through the emptiness, and I felt like I had been there for hundreds or even thousands of years and was aware of every moment. After a while of the sheer boredom and loneliness, I saw another spirit, I guess, that looked the same and felt both of us reach out to each other. We stayed close to each other for a bit, but the pull was too strong, and eventually we were dragged away in opposite directions. That was the only piece of warmth or happiness that I felt there, until I started to feel an enormous presence like that one, but magnified 1,000-fold. I could start to see tons of lights just like mine all together, and reached out for them. That's when I woke up. When I woke up, I felt like everything in the dream was explained to me. We don't stop existing once we die, but there isn't some greater reward or punishment afterward. We revert back to our base form, our consciousness intact and aware of what's happening, as we are pulled through the vast emptiness of the universe, away from one life and towards another. We grab onto life so hard because it's the only true experience we get to enjoy before we're shuttled back through the cosmos for millennia. And we fear death so strongly because deep down, we know that loneliness is far worse than pain. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. I really do hope it isn't real, because out of all the afterlives I can think of, this one might be the worst. So this happened to me when I was around 6 or 7, and I'm unsure if it was just a crazy dream or a false memory. But here it goes. When I was young, aforementioned 6 or 7, my grandparents and I took a trip to my great-grandparents' house for a family reunion-style get-together. We stayed for 5 days, and the days were fun, but the nights were a different story altogether. I was set to sleep in a spare room on some rickety old bunk beds with my older, I think she was 9, cousin Lori. She took the bottom bunk, and I took the top, because everybody knows that the top bunk is cooler. Literally, the house had no air conditioning, and it was closer to the ceiling fan. Lori's mom was out of work and had been staying with my great-grandma to get back on track and try to find a job. Across from the bunk beds, there was a big hole in the wall where I was told my great-uncle Buck had fallen down trying to roller skate in the house, and his elbow had gone through the wall. The first night I slept there, nothing happened, or if it did, I was just so sleepy from the long drive that I didn't notice. But the second night, I got really freaked out. After Lori and I got in our bunks and Mom turned the lights out, I didn't fall asleep for a while. And when I did, I woke up almost immediately. The room was dark, and when I rolled over to try and look down at the clock on the opposite wall, my eyes were drawn to the hole. It took me a minute to realize what I was seeing. There was something lighter colored moving in the hole. You know how at night, when it's really dark, you can kind of see light or white things? Something in the hole was moving, something white. I leaned and squinted, trying to see what it was. Eventually, it got still, and I realized it was a fucking eyeball. Imagine if you were to look into a dollhouse through a hole you made in the wall of it. It was like I was a doll inside, and this huge fucking eyeball was looking through the hole. The white I saw moving was the white of the eye, growing larger and smaller as the pupil looked around different parts of the room. Now, the hole in the wall wasn't tiny. I'd say it was the size of a dinner plate. So for the eye to take up so much of it that I couldn't see the whole thing, it had to be huge. I was paralyzed with fear and pulled the covers up over my head and lay there sweating in total silence until I eventually fell asleep and morning came. If it had just happened once, I'd say it was just a bizarre dream. But every night that I slept in that room, the eye came back. I'd fall asleep and then jolt awake later, and there it would be in the hole, and I'd be too scared to move. It's a miracle I didn't wet the bed, because if I did, I'd have been too scared to move. I never mentioned it to my grandparents because I was convinced that they'd think it was bad dreams and take away my TV privileges. Isn't it messed up how as a kid, you're more concerned with losing TV access than something that was scaring you so bad at night that you were paralyzed? I did, however, bring it up with Lori on our last day there, and I'll never forget what she said to me, even though it's been 20 years. She looked me in the face, not laughing, and said, "It's okay, he can't get through there, he's too big." To this day, I have no idea what she meant by this. Who is he? Did she see it too? I would have thought she was teasing me, but she said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I didn't. And I still don't know how to take it. Years later, I asked her about it, and she claims to not remember the incident at all. This has led me to speculate that maybe it was just a reoccurring dream that I had as a child, or just a false memory, but I don't know. It's something that has stuck with me in a way that some of the other childhood nightmares I had have not. My grandfather was a badass. He was born in Alberta during the early 30s and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was 9 when his parents left for British Columbia with their only daughter, promised to return, and none of the boys ever saw them again. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a laborer, and bare-knuckle boxed against older men for extra cash. He learned how to track and hunt, and always came home with something to eat when work was scarce. When he was 14, he put the oldest brother in charge of the household, left the res in search of his parents and a better life, and never went back. That was the last time he saw any of his family members. He spent several months riding the trails, befriending some transients while using his fighting skills to defend himself against others. He eventually made his way to Vancouver, the last known whereabouts of his parents and sister, and started working in a pulp mill. At 17, he met my grandmother, and the two eventually married, leading to him giving up his search for his family. They bought some land, and he spent his free time building several houses, which still stand today. One of those sat on the land that he bought with my grandmother, which included acres of wooded area. On this land, my grandparents kept horses and dogs, and small farm animals for eggs and meat. My aunt was born in the early 50s, and my mother came along right before the end of the decade. As far as I've heard, nothing bad or strange really happened until my mom found an old Ouija board and played with it by herself, but I don't know if this has any relation to this story. My mother was around 8 when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their acreage, when the horse stopped dead in its tracks. My mom tried to spur it on, but it was frozen in fear, and all of a sudden, she smelled something like rotting meat and garbage. She pulled back on the reins, and the horse instantly turned and took off back toward the house, almost knocking her off its back several times along the way. Afterwards, the horse was never the same. It would try to kick her, and if she got on it, it would fall backwards, trying to crush her beneath it. Once, it started acting like its old self again, letting her climb onto it, but when she did, it ran toward the road and stopped abruptly, bucking her forwards into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa saw it happen and put a shotgun to its head. The horse just kept breathing heavily and staring straight ahead. My mother barely missed being run over by a car. They saw the horse coming and managed to swerve out of the way, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. He finally decided to give it away when he saw my mother wasn't badly injured. That same horse fell on the next person to ride it, breaking her collarbone, and the father did what my grandpa said he should have done the first time. After that, animals started going missing, and one of the hunting dogs was injured by something during an attack at night. My grandpa set out some traps and stayed in the hayloft above the barn with a shotgun and rifle beside him and slept out there for several nights. He figured it was foxes, or maybe coyotes or wolves, or even a desperate bear, which is what he attributed the smell in the woods to and the horse's reason for losing its mind. But nothing came the entire time he slept out there, and eventually he figured it had moved on to easier prey, or even died. The day after he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was out near the tree line, playing with the injured dog as it was healing. Out of nowhere, the dog started sniffing the air, then positioned itself between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandpa heard the noise and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called back to my grandmother to bring his rifle, then whistled for the dogs. My grandma came out, handed him his gun, and then asked what was going on. As the dogs all started to react like the first one, my grandfather pointed to one of the treetops, which looked longer and thicker than most around it, but it was very slightly moving. It was at least 6 feet tall, he told me later when he'd retell the story, but probably a good bit taller. He took aim and fired, just as he saw a pair of wings starting to open up. Whatever was up there was watching them, but he beat it to the punch. It was a kill shot, directly in the chest with a high-powered rifle, and he instantly started running forward, with all the dogs following him as the thing plummeted to the ground, the breaking of tree branches wholly unmistakable. When he reached the impact point, he raised his rifle again and commanded the dogs forward to flush it out, but they all just stood in place and kept spinning around, trying to catch a scent that seemingly disappeared. A pile of broken branches lay in an obvious landing spot, but beyond that, there was no proof that anything had happened. No body, no blood, no trail. It had either disappeared or gone straight back up the way it came. He searched those woods for several days, but never found a sign of what the thing was, and they didn't see it or experience issues with the animals after that. Decades later, when he was dying, he kept talking about how he saw something. In his delirium, he referred to it as an alien, and said it was coming back for him. I've never seen that man scared of anything in my life, but there was actual panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he had already been too weak to stand on his own for several days, and my grandmother awoke to the sound of a gunshot. She ran outside, fearing the worst, and saw my grandpa lowering his rifle, staring at something in the distance. She took the gun away and helped him back inside, and that was it. I don't know if whatever it was actually did come back for him, or if it was a hallucination of an old memory, but I like to think he went out with a final fuck you to the thing that tried to torment his family all those years ago.